Afghanistan fell back under Taliban rule. We all saw and read. When this happened, Afghan citizens swelled at Kabul's airport. They were desperate to flee their country, just like their president Ashraf Ghani did. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden said this in his address to the nation.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. This did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country.
However, this was just another chapter in Afghanistan's turbulent history. Let's start with who are the Taliban? Well, they are an ultra-extremist Sunni group formed in 1994. The group at the time largely consisted of students, also known as Talib, from the Pashtun areas of eastern and southern Afghanistan. These students had been educated in traditional Islamic schools and had fought during the Soviet-Afghan War in the previous decade. So they seized Kabul in 1996 and imposed on Afghanistan some strict rules based on their own interpretation of Islamic laws. The group was also behind the blowing up of the world's tallest Buddha statues in Bamiyan in 2001. Now their major source of income includes drugs, mining, extortion and taxes, donation, exports, real estate, and funding. But the Taliban had remained out of America's crosshairs until they refused to hand over Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden after the 9/11 attack in 2001. And that led to the US invasion of Afghanistan and the start of a so-called mission to rebuild Afghanistan. But this was with limited military resources, as the US was focused on another war in Iraq at the time. Eventually, more than 50 nations joined the coalition led by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Since 2001, the US has spent $2.26 trillion in Afghanistan, according to an estimate by the Cost of War Project at Brown University. Yet for all those trillions, Afghanistan still has one of the smallest formal economies on the planet. In fact, last year, President Ghani said 90% of the population was living on less than $2 a day, when the then US President Donald Trump struck a deal with the Taliban and initiated a major drawdown. For India's Narendra Modi government, given the history of a plane hijack and the experience of militancy in the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir during the 1990s, the return of Taliban might raise challenges. We spoke to our defense expert Ajai Shukla to understand India's options going forward.
Well, there are two broad options. Either one accepts them and deals with them, or else one opposes them and then does what is needed to make things difficult for them.
Ajay has been covering the issue since long, even before the US invasion of Afghanistan. In fact, he was the only Indian journalist who was reporting from Kabul when the Taliban were ousted in the late 2001.
If India decides to accept the Taliban as the new rulers of Afghanistan, they will first have to re-establish the embassy, re-establish diplomatic relations with Afghanistan. That will involve negotiations with the Taliban on the terms and conditions under which the embassy staff comes back. Then, of course, there is depending on the Taliban's reactions, India could restart its aid projects in Afghanistan. India is one of the biggest aid donors to Afghanistan. There are a large number of Indian projects underway, and the Taliban has already said that it wants India to come back and complete the projects. It's not mentioned what will happen after completing the projects. So India would have to deal with that and resume aid and so on, in the hope that a good working relationship can be built up with the Taliban government. The second option that India has, the alternative, is to oppose the Taliban the way that it did from 1996 to 2001. India was one of the 3 or 4 countries that actively aligned with the Northern Alliance in the north of Afghanistan and opposed the Taliban and formed the bridgehead eventually, which resulted in the Taliban being thrown out of power in 2001. India would have to bring together a number of anti-Taliban factions. There is the Northern Alliance or the United Front or the Pancheri groups, depending on how one sort of calls them. There are the Uzbek groups, there are the Hazaras. These are all potentially anti-Taliban groups. In the early days, 1996 to 2001, India had worked with all these groups to oppose the Taliban. Then India will also have to follow a policy of bringing together countries to oppose the Taliban in international forums and so on. That will result in a bad working relationship. It will result in the Taliban getting closer to Pakistan. And these are the difficulties that India will face if it decides to oppose the Taliban.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.